When the news broke of 215 unmarked graves containing Indigenous children in British Columbia, Canada, co-directors Julian Brave Noisecat and Emily Cassie decided to embark on a project that would reveal the depths of horror at residential schools. Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing Sugarcane, a new documentary premiering on Disney Plus and Hulu December 10th. Briefly, Sugarcane is an eye-opening and devastating film which brings to light new evidence of infanticide at St. Joseph's Mission School in British Columbia. The title of the film refers to a First Nations reserve in BC. Briefly, beginning in the 19th century, a network of educational institutions were established to solve the Indian problem. These educational institutions ended up being torture facilities that shattered families and murdered children. The documentary has a lot of moving parts. First, we are following director Julian and his father as they try to reconcile. We are also following investigators, community leaders, as well as survivors. It is a visually stunning film that not only focuses on those who have passed, but also those forced to carry these atrocities with them every day. The pacing of the film also reflects this. The documentary gives time for each storyline to evolve and time to breathe so we can appreciate the gravity of these crimes and also the people working tirelessly to try and find justice. I felt the documentary was very, very careful not to exploit anyone. All the conversations and revelations and confessions come out very naturally. At the heart of the story is director Julian and his father Archie, who escaped infanticide at St. Joseph's Mission. Julian and his father have a very tumultuous relationship. His father, as well as many others in this community, have had to live on with the memories of what happened to them. Legally, Indigenous children were not allowed to be raised by their families, and as a result, their sense of community and safety was totally shattered, as well as their childhood. One of the strengths of this documentary is the way it utilizes the CBC, this archival footage they were able to show. And a lot of these clips are just filled with propaganda, and they also help emphasize how these children were brainwashed and taught to believe that they were inferior. The purpose of these schools was to inhibit Indigenous communities from expanding. I thought the documentary clips from the CBC, this archival footage they were able to show, really was quite terrifying because in these clips you see children running to priests and hugging them. And in reality, they were actually running away from these people in fear. I also think that Sugarcane did a good job of really unpacking how the media and the government was complicit in normalizing and facilitating a lot of the horrors that took place. What makes this documentary unique is how intimately it approaches its subjects. Most people have no interest in reliving their trauma, and even if they did, they don't really know where to start. Survivors who tried to find justice and tried to come forward were only met with more abuse and more violence. And unfortunately, many of the perpetrators that caused them so much harm are either dead or just too old to be held accountable. And many of these survivors also have to contend with the fact that they are children of abusers. I mean, there's a lot of layers to this. There are the children who were taken from their families, and then there are the children who were born at these residential schools. And those that were born are really left to their own devices to try and piece together their past. At the moment, the church and the government have pretty much offered little more than apologies to make up for the intense violence that they suffered. And because they're unwilling to release records of priests and other officials suspected of abuse, many of these institutions remain safe havens for perpetrators. Now, I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, and I have to tell you, I did not know about residential schools until very late in life. And the more we find out about these schools, the more horrifying it becomes, and it does alter your perception of your own community and what it means to be Canadian in particular. Canada is a very interesting country in that it really prides itself on cultural acceptance and multiculturalism. However, its history with establishing and then downplaying the atrocities that occurred at these residential schools has been an abomination. You can see this in the documentary. A lot of these communities are very isolated, far away from like big cities or urban areas, and therefore it's not that difficult for the government to make it seem like an isolated incident, like this is just an unfortunate moment in Canadian history, when in fact it is Canadian history. Like, most Canadians they did not know about these residential schools until quite late. And a lot of us don't really appreciate the gravity of the situation. And the Canadian government has been very insistent on reconciliation and bringing this chapter to a close. However, you cannot find reconciliation until the truth of what happened has come out, and until we've had a public conversation about this, until we really get to the bottom of everything that took place. And at the moment, it's communities most affected by residential schools that are leading these investigations. And you see in the documentary, a lot of these investigators have been working tirelessly for decades, but they've been met with roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And the more time that passes, the more we find out about these schools, not just in Canada, but also in the United States. And Sugarcane is just one story of many. Julian and his father is representative of a lot of different families in this community as well as others. And one of the questions I think this documentary tries to ask is, what are we supposed to do with all this information? Because we can't hold the perpetrators accountable, and these institutions are not really doing much other than saying, I'm sorry. The closure of these schools did not end the trauma that these schools caused. At the moment, it feels like a game of hot potato. We find out more about the horrors that took place. The government apologizes, and then again we find out like more horrors that took place and the government apologizes. And so I think what this documentary does well is that there's so much about these schools that we don't know, and we really have to get to the bottom. And until the truth is uncovered, until it's brought to the light, then reconciliation is simply not possible. And so I invite you to watch this documentary once it premieres on Hulu and Disney+. Easily one of the best documentaries of the year. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.